Good morning, everyone. It's been only a day and a half. Is that hard to believe? I would imagine so. For newcomers, I will tell you there's this thing that happens, which is for the first day and a half, your mind expands and expands and expands until it feels like it's at the outer reaches of where it can go. And then for the next 6 days, you realize that you can go further. It's pretty incredible. I think people are feeling the stretch already, and I hope you continue to enjoy that. This morning, I actually want to dedicate my remarks to a good friend who passed away in an unfortunate accident about 3 weeks ago. His name was Moshe Grun, his Hebrew name Moshe Shlomo ben Tova Sarah, who, when I think about morality and Jewish law, I very much think about him. And when I think about what happened to him, I very much think about the questions of justice. And I just want to dedicate my remarks to him this morning. So I thank you for participating in that. We're going to pick up on Yehuda's theme from yesterday, or where we left off. Rabbinic moral courage. When we think about the terms justice and righteousness, or the Hebrew terms for our theme, tzedek and mishpat, I want to give a little bit of color to those terms. Because honestly, when I hear justice and righteousness, I say to myself, well, why aren't they synonymous? Isn't justice the same as righteousness? Isn't righteousness the same as justice? And significantly, the Hebrew tells us a story that makes us realize that sometimes they really aren't the same, and sometimes they don't overlap. And that can cause us a lot of tension and anxiety. The term mishpat, though we translate it as justice, because this is what we want law to be, literally just means law. The term tzedek, we translate as righteousness, means fairness. We want law to be justice, and we want righteousness to mean fairness. I want to explore with you the question this morning of what happens when tzedek and mishpat are not the same. What happens when law and fairness conflict? I actually want to explore this from one particular perspective. If I were to ask people in this room or elsewhere, if the result that you want, the moral result, is impossible, given a particular law, which would you side with? The law or the result that you need to see in the world? There are some people who would fall down on the consequences, who would say it's about the result. It's about the goal. This is actually a school of philosophical thought called teleology. Morality that stems from a desire to see a particular goal, a particular telos, a particular outcome, and that's a very valid understanding of morality. Morality is about outcome. Fairness, one might say. There are others who would lean more towards the side of the law. What are the rules? Can I get to that moral outcome through the rules, or do I have to break the rules in order to get there? The people who would go towards the rules would find themselves, roughly speaking, in the camp of Immanuel Kant. This camp is called deontology, from the Greek deon, meaning rule, to rules-based morality. And that is another legitimate form of moral philosophy. This morning, I would like to talk about the question of morality versus law from the perspective of those who feel bound by the law. Yesterday, when we spoke about the prophetic and the rabbinic, it seemed clear that the prophetic was about the result. The prophetic was about the fairness. The prophetic was about outcome, teleology. What happens in the case of the rabbinic, where law is something that is binding? The system is not teleological in its essence, but is deontological, is rule-based in its essence. Now, why do I want to explore this? Aside from an enjoyable pedagogical experience, having yesterday spoken about one type and today speaking about another, which of course is part of what we plan, I'm very concerned that Jews today who find themselves in the deontological camp and Jews today who find themselves in the teleological camp, that is, Jews who find themselves motivated and even bound by Jewish values, and Jews who find themselves bound by Jewish law, the gulf is getting wider and wider. And I want to see a conversation between those groups. So I want to talk about what moral values those groups can share and how they can reach the moral results together. The second reason I want to talk about this is because we all have deontological moments in our lives. If we're taking ourselves out of the realm of Jewish law and that conversation, we all live under the law of a particular country. We all live by the ethics or the unwritten or written laws of our professions. There are unwritten laws of etiquette. And even there are deontological or rule-based moments in ethics that we all share. And I want to show one to you now. Leo Katz is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania and is perhaps the boldest and most honest lawyer I have ever read. He wrote a book called Ill-Gotten Gains, Evasion, Blackmail, Fraud, and Kindred Puzzles of the Law. This is number 2 in your source sheet. His goal was to defend the type of deontological reasoning, the type of rules-based reasoning that allows people to find tax loopholes. That's his goal. But he's not going to start with that. He's going to start with something much more sublime, much more philosophical, much less threatening. He starts with the classic case that deontologists, rule-based moral philosophers use. Number 2, think of a hypothetical hospital administrator who is constantly involved in allocation decisions about scarce life support systems. It frequently will happen that he puts someone on life support who, after a few days, stands only a modest chance of really benefiting from it. That is, of making an eventual recovery. In that time, other patients will have arrived at the hospital who stand a much better chance of benefiting from the very same system, but it will have to be denied access because a less promising patient is already hooked up to the equipment. Moral quandary. The administrator is sorely tempted to unhook the unpromising patient and connect the equipment to the others because he knows that this course will save several other lives while merely accelerating the death of one already doomed patient. But he can't do that, he realized. Pretty clearly that would be tantamount to organ harvesting. And although he feels bad, he realizes there's nothing he can do. Despite the result that he wants to see, he's stuck because of a general moral rule of you can't kill someone. You can't harvest organs. Then inspiration strikes. He remembers that there are different life support systems on the market. Some of them go on for a long time without needing much servicing or refilling. Others have to be rotated out every few days, replaced by other systems while they are being serviced. In fact, the equipment that requires frequent rotation is a little better than the equipment that doesn't, but most hospitals find it too bothersome to use. What occurs to the hospital administrator, I should tell you that that is the sound that educators like most, that we are following all on the same line. Thank you for that. The hospital administrator realizes that if he buys equipment that has to be disconnected regularly and replaced and serviced, he obtained a flexibility he didn't have before. Once a patient has been disconnected, and once the decision has to be made whether to hook him back up to the new machine or to use that machine for someone else who is more promising, it's a whole new ballgame. Surely we are entitled to ask before we decide who to hook up to some life support system, who would most likely benefit from it. And that way we can pass up the unpromising patient and devote all of our attention to the more promising one. I understand that if the unpromising patient is your relative, this does not seem so clear. However, what he is saying is that there are moments in ethics where the way you do something makes all the difference. The outcome is just as moral, whether you do it through breaking a moral rule or not. But the process itself, there's something to it. And I bring this only as an example of the many deontological moments that all of us experience in our lives, even if this doesn't resonate with us. So those are the two reasons I'm talking about this issue. The health of the Jewish community and the Jewish people, and use this as a metaphor for other moments of deontology or rules in your life, even if it doesn't relate to you when you think about your Jewish practice or your Jewish belief or your Jewish perspective. If you're bearing with me in this project, which I really hope you are, because I think that the stakes are high, what we're going to do together is we're going to talk about what happens when a person who feels committed to rules that cause moral challenge, what happens when those two encounter one another? In the spirit of no one having a monopoly on justice, that's what we're going to discuss this morning. There are going to be two parts. Part number one, you might simply ask the question, throw away the rule. If the value of the outcome is so important, why are we even bothering with the rules? So I need to offer you a few perspectives on what deontology holds, what rule-based living holds, and particularly from a Jewish lens, and why there are people who are so wedded to it. And the second half will actually be a study of rabbinic writings from the Talmud, where we see the rabbis grappling with this question, and we try to understand what their theology is about this question, and what their ethical impulse is about this question. And then we'll open to some very difficult questions from the audience. In praise of rule-based living, or deontology, I'm going to offer you four perspectives because I don't think it's one simple thread running through the ideology of rule-based living. I think there are many aspects and many dimensions that appeal to different people in different ways. The first I want to present to you in the name of Professor Nechama Leibowitz, in number 4. She doesn't write this in a philosophical treatise or tract. She writes this in her interpretation of Scripture and her commentary on Scripture. And what she's noticing is that immediately after the Israelites received the Torah at Mount Sinai, there is a parasha, there is a section in the Torah called Mishpatim, laws, that begins with, and these are the laws which you shall set before them. And which law comes first in that set? The law of the Hebrew indentured servant. Take a look with me at number 4. And these are the laws which you shall set before them. Exodus 21:1. Some commentators see in the laws of the Hebrew servant the first laws that appear in Parashat Mishpatim, that section of the Torah, a theological connection to the events of Mount Sinai. And here's the first law that comes up. If you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th year he shall go free for nothing. The first rule is you may not keep other Jews, other Hebrews, other Israelites as your slaves forever. The moral implications as to everyone else, it's for a different time. Come back next year, okay? Why is this? One reading may simply be, well, because God freed the Jewish people from Egypt. This is anthropocentric. This is human-centered. Human beings, in this case Israelites, are designed to be free. So God let them go. Professor Leibowitz goes in a different direction. Skip with me to the end of number 4. She cites the rabbis. The very last line. She cites a midrash, a rabbinic homily. Why is it that you may not hold on to an Israelite slave for more than 6 years? Because they are my servants, God says. They are my slaves, and not the servants of servants. This I view as the commander perspective on rule-based living. There's a commander and we're commanded, so we have to do it. I'm stuck in these rules. Very simple, plain and simple. And I think most people are most familiar with this perspective. I want to add 3 other perspectives that may add a bit of color. The second perspective I call law as language. And this is not my own creation. In the 19th century, there emerged a German school of legal thought called the Historical School of Jurisprudence. Friedrich von Savigny was the father of this school, and essentially what this school had to say was that it's all about the way that law develops among the people that teaches us what law is really about. In number 6, he sets out something very basic. Looks back to Roman culture and the way that they viewed law, and sees something instructive for his own day. And in our context, something that is a justification for rule-based living. Number 6, what indeed made Rome great was the quick, lively political spirit which made her ever ready to renovate the forms of her constitutions, that the new merely ministered to the development of the old, a judicious mixture of the adhesive and progressive principles. In the law, consequently, the general Roman character was strongly marked, holding fast by the long established without allowing themselves to be fettered by it when it no longer harmonized with a new popular prevailing theory. For this reason, the history of Roman law down to the classical age exhibits everywhere a gradual, wholly organic development. If a new form is framed, it is immediately bound up with an old established one, and thus participates in the maturity and the fixedness of the latter. Law will help with continuity. There will be change, but at least you start with something that holds you, something that allows you to move incrementally. And I call this law as language because Savigny himself calls it that. And what he means by that is that the law itself becomes a part of the language of the people, the way they speak, the way they understand the world, and it does not necessarily mean that change is not possible. Just as language changes incrementally, thus law can as well. But you need the vocabulary for that continuity. That's number 2. Number 3, I'm very proud to be citing from 2 different members of Machon Hartman. One, the founder, Rabbi Dr. David Hartman, Rabbi Professor David Hartman, and another, the current president of Shalom Hartman North America, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, which always honestly inspires me when I can quote people with whom I am affiliated in the most direct ways. I find that tells me I'm in the right place, and I hope that you find that too over the next several days. David Hartman, very different approach. If you look at number 7, this is not the approach of the commander. This is not the approach of language. This is the approach of law as relationship. Law as a relationship builder with the commander, with God, a God intoxication, if you will. In number 7, from the previous chapter, he says it emerges that there are 2 important ways in which Halakha, that is Jewish law, framed as a communally mediated religious system dedicated to seeking God's presence in every aspect of life, can function as a vital spiritual resource for the Jewish people. For those interested in deepening their involvement with the Jewish community, perhaps seeking meaning in an enhanced identification with their historical family, halakhic experimentation can serve as an entryway to collective spiritual life. Law as relationship. And the last, law as memory, number 8. Whereas history informs, memory commands. History enables standing apart, outside, above the past. We learn from its mistakes, we correct misperceptions, we salvage that which is forgotten. Memory, meanwhile, either by design or accident, wields a commanding force over those who remember. The idea of commandedness is more complicated in Jewish text and Jewish thought than it is often portrayed. We tend to think of commandedness in the most simple and straightforward terms. God says, do X, and we, the Israelites, Moses, Adam, or whomever, is then supposed to obey. But this model of imposed commandedness, do this or else, is not our only option in understanding Jewish responsibility. A number of our classic texts on commandedness interweave memory, narration, and personal ownership into the very process of how we integrate the commands incumbent upon us. In Exodus, probably 12:5, maybe 12:51, I'm not going to ask Yehuda, even though he's here. In Exodus, God instructs Moses to command the Israelites to consecrate the firstborns, both the humans and the animals. What does consecrate mean? Taken alone, it is hard to say. Does God mean now to exact retribution or perhaps payment from the freed Israelites, seeing their freedom as dependent on the death of the firstborns of the Egyptians? The commandment seems dangerously ambiguous. And so Moses, rather remarkably, translates the commandment not just into a viable morality for the Israelites, sacrifice the animals, redeem the children, but he does so through a careful and programmatic narration of the Exodus story and as part of a long list of other commandments that do not seem to be part of God's original command. And most important, opens his repetition of God's words to the Israelites with the phrase, remember. Memory is a tool of commandedness. When we actually remember, commanding power naturally flows. Memory, narrative, being part of community, history, some of our greatest commandments that Jews who find themselves to be more deontologically or rule-oriented and Jews who find them to be more results-oriented and value fairness-oriented find themselves celebrating the holidays. Those holidays are all about memory. That commandedness is all about being part of a national story and an ethnic story. So 4 different approaches, and you notice that I didn't critique any of them because that's not my major concern. My major concern here is that we understand that when someone is coming to this conflict between ethics and law, or morality and law, there are values that are holding them into that law. There are values that are not holding them hostage. They are values that they choose. But now, the conflict, because that's where it really matters. Is it going to be the case that those who are rule-oriented are just not going to see the moral conflicts? Or are just going to throw up their hands and say, that's not the emphasis of our system. The emphasis of our system is law. And sorry, we have nothing to do here, or we don't want to do anything here. And I will answer to you with an emphatic no. An emphatic no based on the way the rabbis deal with these conflicts. The rabbis do not close their ears or their eyes to moral challenges, neither moral challenges that are not addressed by Jewish law, nor moral challenges that are created by following Jewish law. In that rule-based perspective, they do not shut their eyes or ears to that. In fact, the way that the system of Jewish law is presented often is that it itself, even if it's in its mode of what are the rules, is for a greater cause of what are the results of following those rules. Whether it's talking about the reasons behind commandments, whether it's talking about not just the action that a person is doing, but what is the midah, what is the character trait that it reflects? You may recall in Ethics of Our Ancestors, which many people call Ethics of Our Fathers, but I think the women probably had some ethical ideas as well. In Ethics of Our Ancestors, you may recall there's a debate as to what kind of perspective is it when one says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. We call that capitalism. In Ethics of the Ancestors, we find what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That's okay. Alternatively, this is Midat Sodom. This is the way the people of Sodom thought and felt. That is not a rule-based intuition. That is a morality, results-based intuition. And I want to share with you a few of the modalities and strategies that the rabbis use to deal with this issue, and then open it up for the hard questions. The first two modalities are easy. They're easy because I'm going to deal with issues that relate to where the law simply does not require the ethical. It doesn't clash with the ethical. It simply doesn't require you to go that extra mile. That's not so difficult. It's a little bit troubling to look at law as the floor as opposed to the ceiling. But it's not, I don't know that it hits you in the gut in the same way. But nonetheless, the rabbis take a look at that too. If you walk with me in your minds, that is, to number 10. This is what we call supererogatory behavior, lifnim mishurat hadin, going above and beyond the letter of the law. What happens when the law does not require you to do more? That air conditioning, they lied to us. I just want to let you know. I'm aware. We're doing okay? All right. Fan yourself. Could someone? Yeah. Well, more about the air and less about the water. I have. Thank you. Speaking of results orientation. What happens when the law doesn't ask you to go as far as you think you should go? The rabbis are aware, supererogation, lifnim mishurat hadin, going above and beyond the letter of the law, something we've all heard of. But where it comes from is quite interesting. Number 10, there was a certain woman who showed a dinar, a coin, an ancient coin, to Rabbi Chia, who apparently knew if a coin would pass muster in market or was defunct, who told her that it was good, it was usable. Later she came again to him and said to him, I showed it to others, and they told me it was bad. And in fact, I could not pass it. I was unable to use it in the marketplace. What is Rabbi Chia's responsibility to this woman? Essentially, it's his fault. But is he culpable? Chia said to Rav, go forth and change it for a good one, and write down in my register that it was a bad transaction. We'll give her another coin. But why should Rabbi Chia be different from another case of Danko and Isur, also money changers, who would be exempt from reimbursing a customer under these circumstances? Why? Because they needed no instruction. That is because they are experts, and so they are assumed to be correct about the authenticity of the coin, even if others concur with their judgment. Surely Rabbi Chia also needed no instruction. In other words, Rabbi Chia could have turned to this woman and said, I'm sorry, those people who wouldn't let you pass it, they're wrong. I'm right. Deontology, I followed the rules. I know what I'm talking about. They're not experts, that's it. Rabbi Chia acted lifnim mishurat hadin, within the law. That is to say, as we call it, beyond the letter of the law. On the principle learned by Rabbi Joseph. Rabbi Joseph is about to use a verse in the book of Exodus to explain to us where the concept of lifnim mishurat hadin comes from. The verse that he's going to cite in Exodus is the verse that God says to Moses when Moses' father-in-law tells him, you can't judge on your own, you have to choose some other people to help you, and God ratifies it and says, he's right. And when you choose those other people, I want you to teach them a bunch of things, says God. The verse in Exodus, I want you to teach them the laws and the teachings. I want you to teach them the way in which they shall walk, the path, that is, that they will follow, and the act that they will do. Haderech yelchu ba ve'et ha'ma'aseh asher ya'asun. These two comments are redundant. If you teach them the laws and you teach them the teachings, you don't need to teach them the path that they will follow and the thing that they will do. So Rabbi Joseph squeezes out of this, lifnim mishurat hadin. And you shall show them the source of livelihood. the way, loving kindness, that they must walk visiting the sick. Therein, yelchu va, that they will walk in burial. The work means the law. I translate it as the thing, the action, that they will do. Lifnim mishurat hadin. What a strange interpretation of a verse. He's teaching people who are going to judge about what the legal system is and what it's supposed to be. But no, Rabbi Joseph adds to it. You're going to teach these people not just how they're going to judge, you're going to teach them about visiting the sick, you're going to teach them about morality, you're going to teach them about what it means to go beyond the letter of the law that they think they're training for. And of course this comes from God, God's self. So people who view the law, if they view it as coming from God, and then they view God as giving a directive to go beyond the letter of the law, which God is it? The prophetic God? The God of morality? Or is it the God of law? Or is it both? We see the very same thing occurring when we continue to look for indications that the rabbis realize that sometimes the law is the floor and not the ceiling. In number 12, God is evoked yet again to say, the laws may say one thing, but I'm telling you, you have to do more. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia in number 12 is talking about the laws of transactions. If I promise you that I'm going to make a deal with you, if I sign on a dotted line, can I renege? If I just shake hands, can I renege? If I give you the money, can I change my mind? If I've taken the object and haven't paid you, can I change my mind? So there are all sorts of rules about this in Jewish law. And the rule that's being suggested in the Mishnah in Bava Metzia is that when you take the object that you're buying, you are bound to pay for it. There's no reneging. You can't change your mind, give it back, it's over. It's done. And the way the Mishnah puts it is this is the rule, all movables, that is the items themselves, affect acquisition of other movables. In other words, you've taken what you want, you've essentially allowed the person who's selling it to acquire your money. How so? If a customer took fruit and gave money, the customer may not renege. But what if it's the reverse? Not that I took the object and now I'm obligated by Jewish law to complete the purchase. But what if I gave you the money and I haven't taken the object yet? Can I renege then? Yes, I can, says the Mishnah, but I better not, says the Mishnah. Continues, if, however, the customer has only paid money and has not yet taken the fruit, the customer may renege. However, they said the one who punished the generation of the flood will also punish the person who does not keep their word. That is not about rules. That is about results. That is about character. That is about a God who is not only a God of rules, but a God of life, nature, the way things work out. And it's fascinating that instead of attributing this to people, the rabbis attribute dealing with the moral conflict to God, God's self. It's not that we hold God to God's standards, it's that God holds us to God's standards. And God holds God's own law to God's standards. And likewise, when it comes to the tougher cases, it's an easy thing to say when law doesn't go far enough, and then we invoke God to say you have to go further. But what happens when God's law involves us in a moral conflict? Where's the God of life then and the God of law then? It would be an easy stereotype to say, gone. It's not the way the rabbis do it. Number 14, the case of people who are born as illegitimate children as a result of a married woman having an affair. That law of proclaiming someone illegitimate and the ramifications that attend to that declaration, limitations on marriage, stigma, that's a moral challenge. It's a moral challenge. In fact, the rabbis themselves call this is what Scripture means when it says the crooked cannot be made straight. Parents did something and children are now going to suffer? How can we imagine that? And the way this midrashic text puts it is that it's not how can we imagine that. God doesn't want us to do that. Leviticus Rabbah, number 14. Rav said, illegitimate offspring, a mamzer, do not live more than 30 days. The purpose of that? Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we call legal fiction. If they don't live more than 30 days, then nobody here could possibly be one. Rabbi Chunya said, every 60 or 70 years, the Blessed Holy One brings a great pestilence to the world and destroys illegitimate children, but takes legitimate offspring with them. The reason being that legitimate offspring are people who have sinned, but God doesn't want people to know that they've sinned. Wow, 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 in terms of the morality in this passage, not easy. But what I will say is this is another attempt, whether it's tasteful or distasteful to you, it's another attempt to say, mamzer, it doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, no, it's not possible. It's not possible. That's not the way the world works. There's every 60 or 70 years, that gets wiped out. They don't live past 30 days. It's legal fiction. No one believes that. No one thinks that's true. But it's really helpful. Oh, what a chutzpah. God makes a rule about illegitimate children. And again, when I say God, this is through the mediation of the interpretation of the rabbis. This is a very particular perspective. I'm talking to you from the rule-based perspective. Okay? What a chutzpah. No, not true. The next paragraph. We're going to see some people who didn't understand how the legal fiction was supposed to be used, and did understand it rather literally. Rabbi Zera, when he came here, he heard people being called out as illegitimate offspring. He heard people being declared, everyone should know so-and-so is illegitimate, don't marry them, stigmatize them, etc., etc. He said, what about Rabbi Chunya's comments that illegitimate offspring doesn't live more than 30 days? Rabbi Jacob, son of Rabbi Acha, responded, well, this is according to what Rava and Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Illegitimate offspring do not live more than 30 days. When? When the thing is unknown. But when it's been made known, the illegitimate offspring will live. Well, of course they will. Right? If you don't talk about them as that, they don't exist as that. But if you're going to talk about them as that, they're going to exist to 120 as that. In the days of Rabbi Berechia, a Babylonian came here. And Rabbi Berechia in here is Palestine. Rabbi Berechia knew that he was of illegitimate pedigree. He went to the rabbi and requested, give me merit. He was really saying, give me a job. Rabbi Berechia told him, go and come back tomorrow, and I will give a public declaration about your good pedigree. The next day, this man returned and found Rabbi Berechia teaching in synagogue. He waited for him until he finished. When the rabbi finished his teaching, he went over to Rabbi Berechia. Rabbi Berechia said to those who assembled, our brothers have given this man pass, but he is a bastard. He tells everyone. He declares it. They made a declaration about him. When they left, the man said, Rabbi, I asked you for life, and you've ruined my life. He responded, no, I've saved your life. As Rava and Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, illegitimate offspring do not live more than 30 days. When the thing is unknown. But now that it's been known, you'll live. Wow. If the Midrash ended here, I would have to use an academic, scholastic perspective to read this as satirical. But I don't need to do that because look at the next part of the Midrash. Another interpretation. You should know that this entire Midrash is actually about the verse that talks about a man who was born of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian man who cursed God. And the entire Midrash is trying to deal with what happens to children of marriages that are seen as illegitimate in the Jewish community. That's why they're dealing with the question of bastardy, because it brings up the whole question of identity. Another interpretation, and the son of an Israelite woman went out, and the end is he went out and cursed God, and I turned and considered all oppression, says the Midrash, quoting from Ecclesiastes. Hanina the tailor interpreted the verse as applying to bastards, to illegitimate children. And I turned and considered all the oppression. These are illegitimate children. And behold, the tears of the oppressed. These parents' mothers sinned. I might argue somebody else in their sin too. But these miserable ones, they distance them. These miserable ones, they distance them. Who are these miserable ones? This one's father slept with a forbidden woman. But what has this one done? And what concern is it of his? And they have no comforter, continues the verse. But on the side of their oppressors, there is power. Listen to what the Midrash says about this. This is Israel's great Sanhedrin, high court, which comes against them, the illegitimate children, with the power of Torah and distances them. And on the basis of a mamzer, an illegitimate child shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, and they have no comforter. Says the Blessed Holy One, it is my task to comfort them. For in this world there is taint among them, but in the time to come, Zechariah says, the prophet, I have seen them all gold, of pure gold. God says, what are you doing? You are using my Torah to oppress people. Use the legal fiction. Don't declare them. Imagine that that status doesn't last past 30 days. Why are you using the power of Torah to create moral problems? Don't do that. This is an incredible admission on the part of a group of people, the rabbis, who saw themselves primarily as rule-based, where they're saying, no, we don't disengage when it comes to the moral results. We just engage differently. We use a legal fiction. We add the supererogatory. We find loopholes. We reinterpret. Let's take a look at some reinterpretation. Number 13 in your appendix. The air is on and we're moving. I feel that. Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 71a, very bothered by the following two cases in the Bible. Case number 1, parents who put their children to death. The Ben Sorer Umoreh, the rebellious son, who is put to death. And the way the rabbis interpret it, it's because he ate a certain amount of meat and drank a certain amount of wine. And the apostate city, the Ir HaNidachat, the city that has fallen to idolatry, which is to be destroyed, razed to the ground completely. Everyone killed. In the appendix, number 13. The rabbis are bothered by this. These are biblical laws. The rabbis are bothered by them. That statement in and of itself says something. The next question is, but what are they going to do about it? Is their answer going to be, our hands are tied? No. Number 13. To which rabbi does the following correspond? It was taught that the Torah category of the rebellious child has never happened in real life and will never happen. So why was it written? To learn and to be rewarded. Do you know why it never happened? because the way the rabbis interpreted it is that the two parents have to look alike, be the same height, have to come to court a certain amount of time. Death by fiat. Right? They killed it in committee. They added so many things to it, it was never possible to actually have it happen. So why was it written? To learn and to be rewarded? Its own question. You may say this corresponds with Rabbi Simon. As it is taught, Rabbi Shimon says, because someone ate 180 grams of meat and drank half a liter of Italian wine, his parents are going to stone him? Enjoy conversational cocktails. Rather, it never was and never will be. Rather, learn and get reward. I need to tell you, I'm trying to give you the perspective that says the rule base doesn't have to ignore the results. That's not the only thrust in the conversation with the rabbis. Rabbi Jonathan says, actually, I saw such a child and I sat upon his grave. There are always going to be strong deontologists. There are always going to be people who are strongly rules-based. To which rabbi does the following correspond? It was taught that the Torah category of the apostate city never was and never will be. So why was it written? To learn and be rewarded. Like whom? Like Rabbi Eliezer. As it was taught, Rabbi Eliezer says that any city with even one mezuzah cannot be declared an apostate city and thus be razed. Why? For the verse says, and gather all of its spoils, the apostate city, to the main square and burn them. And if there is one mezuzah, this is impossible. As it is written, you shall not do thus to the Lord your God, which means you shall not destroy God's name. You can't burn a mezuzah, it has God's name in it. Wow. Wow. That's a very rule-based way to getting to something moral, right? You can't burn the mezuzah. You can take God's name and melt it in waters to drink, to have the sota, the suspected adulterous drink, for the good of the peace in the home. They probably could have done the same thing here. They probably could have said, no, what are you talking about? It's for the sake of something greater. That's okay. Or they desecrated their mezuzot so much that they don't even have the name. This is morality through process. That's what we see here. But of course, Rabbi Jonathan said, I saw such a city and I sat upon its heap. This is not a univocal perspective. There are different competing discussions, as you will find in any community that finds itself to be principally, emphatically rule-based. Some will be interested in getting to the moral outcome by hook or by crook. Others will assume that the law is the moral outcome, and others will assume my hands are tied, right? But the rabbis are setting forth strategies of what can and should be done. Here's the toughest one. The toughest one is when we actually come up against a wall. And this is the risk. It's the risk of deontology. It's the risk of rule-based living. It's the Talmud in Brachot 19b. The question is, how does human dignity rank in comparison with Jewish law? Up until this point, what we've seen is that over and over again, when the rabbis are looking for morality, they look to the same God who gave them the law that doesn't always jive with that morality. In some ways, it's their way of saying, our moral intuition is ratified as divine, as by God. Our moral intuitions in some ways are prophetic. But there are also moments where the God of law is going to win in a rule-based system over the God of life or of morality. That's the risk. That's the risk. Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, one who finds a mixture of wool and linen in their clothing, shatnez, should undress even in the marketplace. Funny to you, not to the person wearing the wool and linen. Wow. What's the logic behind this? There is no wisdom, nor understanding, nor counsel against the Lord. A verse from Proverbs. Ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna leneged Hashem. That whole chapter in Proverbs, and I urge people who are interested in this topic to read it. That entire chapter of Proverbs is all about justice and morality. And the moment that it says there is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord, you realize that we're in for a sacrificial moment. Anywhere God's name will be profaned, that is, by the desecration of the rules themselves, of the mitzvot themselves. This is not chilul Hashem, profanation of God's name, the way we often talk about it, of a bad name for Jews, for God. This is actually talking about the desecration of a command, of a mitzvah. We cannot give honor to even the rabbi. Come and learn. The dignity of people is so great that it overrides a negative commandment of the Torah. Why not say there is no wisdom, nor understanding, nor counsel against the Lord? Rav, the son of Shiva, explained this before Rav Kahana. He said, well, when we say dignity, human dignity is so important that it overrides a negative commandment, it's a particular negative commandment we have in mind. It doesn't mean it overrides all of Torah law, because after all, we just saw there's no wisdom or counsel before God. Sorry, if it's a Torah law, undress in the street. Human dignity, sorry. There's something more authoritative. Rav, the son of Shiva, says, the time when human dignity trumps a negative commandment in the Torah, that negative commandment is the commandment that says, don't deviate from what the rabbis tell you. Rav, the son of Shiva, again, explained this before Rav Kahana regarding the negative commandment of thou shalt not deviate from the words of the sages, left or right. They laughed at him. Is the negative commandment of thou shalt not deviate a biblical commandment? A commandment that tells you to follow the rabbis? There are two tiers in this legal system. There's the biblical tier, laws that are in the Bible, eat matzah on Passover, and then there's the rabbinic tier. You're telling me that this beautiful grand statement of human dignity trumps a negative commandment in the Torah is about a negative commandment that's about following the rabbis? It's not trumping a negative commandment in the Torah, it's trumping the rabbis. So human dignity trumps the rabbis. Rav Kahana said, a great person has said something, do not mock him. All of rabbinic law is authorized by the verse, thou shalt not deviate, and where rabbinic law conflicts with human dignity, the rabbis were permissive. He says, this is a bigger deal than you think. To say that it just overrides rabbinic law is to misunderstand the gravity with which rabbinic law is meant to be viewed. Rabbinic law comes from the Torah as well, so it's as though it's violating a biblical commandment. But what you have here is the first instance that I've shared with you where we begin to encounter the wall. But my hands are tied. Now I want you to see that this, but my hands are tied, is my hands are partially tied. The biblical, ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna leneged Hashem. I can't move. The rabbinic, I can move on that for human dignity. But the section's not over, because it's not just about limitations. It's also about questioning those limitations. Come and learn. and hide yourself from them. This is a verse that basically says, and Danielle quoted on the first evening, if you find your friend's ox, don't hide yourself. If you hide yourself and don't return it, you're doing something wrong. So the rabbis took the term hide yourself out of the context and said, you know what that teaches you? Sometimes you do hide yourself. Sometimes you do violate that rule, and sometimes you do not. How so? If a person is a priest, a Kohen, and the lost item is in a cemetery, and a Kohen is not supposed to go into a cemetery, or the person is elderly, and the item is beneath their dignity to carry, or pull, or push, or schlep, as we might say. Or if someone stands to lose more financially than the person who lost the item by spending their work time trying to bring that other person's ox back. So hide yourself. But why? Perhaps we should argue there's no wisdom, nor understanding, nor counsel against the Lord. This case is different because the word hide yourself is in the Torah. It's a process orientation to getting something moral done. So let us learn from this case more generally. We can always do that. We cannot extrapolate from the realm of finance to the realm of ritual prohibition. And the conversation continues, but what I want to tell you about this conversation is that it never actually completely resigns itself. I feel that when there's a moral quandary challenge, when it comes to biblical law, I feel ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna leneged Hashem. I am confronted not by a God who says that my intuitions are wrong, but by a God who says, but my law is my law. Except, and that's where the continuation of the conversation is, except if you can find a verse that says this, or except if you can reinterpret it, or except if you can. So you really hear the voices pulling in the different directions of what am I supposed to do with my moral intuition, which is prophetic, and the law, which I believe is prophetically given and binding. But they don't give up. But honestly, at the end of the day, there will be a place where they're going to have to give up. It's not always going to work. What I leave you with is the following thought, which is, how do they decide when to give up and when not to give up? What determines that? Certainly, things from within the law determine that to a great extent. How severe is the issue, both morally and legally? How severe would the infraction be? What does it do? Does it threaten to upend the entire legal system? But a very important factor is what's going to pass muster with people. What can the market bear? What's the public perception of what this does in life? And this, in a way, is where the prophetic meets the rabbinic. Oftentimes, it's the prophetic impulse that leads to the rule, process, deontological way of making change. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, why stick with the deontological at all if you believe that the prophetic impulse has moral weight and even divine weight? For at least all four reasons that we mentioned earlier. The commander, law as language and continuity, memory, narrative, God consciousness. So the negotiation continues. But the prophetic is always in there. What we've done this morning is, I think, something very challenging. Instead of discussing justice and righteousness from a perspective that is bound only by those terms as values, we have opened ourselves up to discussing a perspective that even the holders of that perspective find very difficult to talk about. And what we've seen is that the rabbis of the ancient times were not just aware of morality, but they understood that God, the same God who gave them those rules, gave them those moral intuitions, and they did their best to negotiate, as everyone today does their best to negotiate or should do their best to negotiate, and yet the risk still applies that there may be a moment where they're going to say, I cannot square the circle here. Thank you very much. We started about 10 minutes late, so I am going to take the full half hour of questions because I hope that there'll be a lot of color here. Yes, Marla, good morning. Marla? I started off so well until I started interacting with humans. Yes, Ruth, I'm trying, yeah, it's a real problem, yeah.
So why is the Aguna the place where my hands are tied? The marketplace, to a very great extent, does not support that frame of morality.
Mm-hmm.
There are two clear moral hazards that emerge, the moral hazard of bastardy
Mm-hmm.
and the moral hazard of extortion.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this has been a problem that remains intractable. Can you comment about...
Sure. People heard the question? She was asking about women who are chained in marriages, agunot, because of the limitations that Jewish law places on the way that the rabbis understood Jewish law, that the ancient rabbis understood Jewish law, which is held by many communities today, that the man gives the divorce, he initiates the divorce and has to have it written, the document of his own will. So, a few things that I'm going to say about that. Number one, I actually think that when the groundswell is large enough from within a community that abides by that kind of commitment to those laws, I actually think that does impact whether rule-based change will be made. The first example of rule-based change that was made a while ago already is people signing a prenuptial agreement. I'm not going to go into the details, but quite frankly, it's very much akin to some of the methodologies and strategies that we've seen here. It doesn't upend anything, it works through the system. What's more interesting to me is that there is a new Beit Din, there is a new court that is being established to try to use more faithfully and more expansively another loophole. For some reason people think loopholes are negative. I think loopholes, I wrote my dissertation on legal loopholes, that's actually maybe my favorite word in the dictionary. So I'll say circumventions. The circumvention of declaring a marriage null and void from its beginning, from its creation, retroactively. That's something that Rabbi Emanuel Rackman did. It's something that many conservative Batei Din do. And it's something that a brand new Orthodox Beit Din is trying to use more than the current Orthodox Batei Din are willing to use it. So I actually think there's movement on it, but to be frank, I think I would be remiss if I said that it was just about a lack of will or moral groundswell. I think there's something to that, but I also think there's a concern that some of the perspectives, some of the paths that have been put forward to avoid the aguna issue will actually reduce the significance of the sanctity of marriage, such as betrothing someone on condition that you not make them an aguna, so that will actually upend retroactively the union should a man try to make a woman an aguna. That's a legitimate legal argument. I happen to think that the moral issues outweigh that by far, but it's a legal argument. So that's also part of the deontological worldview, is very different from the moral clarity perspective. You really are going to have to engage in persuasion legal persuasion in addition to moral persuasion. Hope that's helpful. I'm trying to go according to how people raise their hands. Yes, sir, your name? Not Marla. Okay, that's fine, Peter.
Isn't there something morally troubling about this whole process of looking for loopholes? I mean, if you put it in a modern context, we have these elaborate tax goals, and there are people who make a good living finding loopholes. And while that's legal, as long as it doesn't become tax evasion, it's sort of morally questionable.
So Leo Katz, actually, he asked about the moral questionability of loopholes. Leo Katz has a wonderful term that he coins. People have heard of the distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion. If you haven't, you should learn about it because one could land you in jail. Tax avoidance, tax evasion. Avoidance is legal, evasion is illegal. He says, what about things that are avoision? Right? He's right. What about things that are avoision? I think that in Jewish law we have examples of things that are avoision, and you'll read my dissertation when it becomes a book, I hope, because that's actually something that I deal with, which is when is a loophole okay and when is it not okay? And a lot of this has to do with the moral impulse, financial distress, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So it's not a full answer, but I will say that along the lines of what I've outlined here, that the telos, the goal, actually informs whether or not you should use the rules to get there. It's very similar. I think that the ends can, I'm not going to say justify the means, the ends can require a certain means, but if those ends aren't noble enough, I don't think even the means are going to be able to ennoble it. Yes?